big thank you for coming for this. The story is of great interest here on Goa as well, as I was just alluding. Though Goa was, of course, not affected by partition, and in fact, Goa remained under colonial rule right until 1961. Many of us did have very strong connections that were ruptured. There's still quite a vibrant community of Goans in Karachi of tens of thousands, but several members of our family were there. But the connection to Pakistan is quite deep. Even people like Shanoy Goembab started his career wanting to be a writer, who's the father of modern Konkani in Karachi. So there's a very interesting story which of great relevance here. So without too much further ado, this is Samrat Chaudhary, Anchal Malhotra, and the wonderful Rakshanda Jalil, who is in conversation tomorrow as well. Please. Let's launch the book, I guess.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Vivek, for that generous introduction. First of all, many congratulations, Anchal, for this splendid book. It's a handsome, big book. It's not a book to be read at a gallop. It's not the sort of book you dip into and say, okay, I've got it. No, it takes a while. You read it, you savor it, well, savor maybe not the right word, but you mull over it. You take a deep breath sometimes and take a step back, because some of the things are so troubling. Anchal, you come from a third generation family of, I don't know whether to say partition survivors, partition victims, partition witnesses. We'll come to that. We'll come to the terminology you think is best. But nevertheless, you come from the third generation of people who went through the partition. Your grandparents, about whom you've written in your debut book. It was a beautiful, luminous book, Remnants of Separation. That too I read with great interest. But tell me, did you not feel you were done with the subject of partition with that book? Did you feel there was still much left? Did you feel that having interviewed the people who themselves went through the partition, you now wanted to interview people like you, people like Samrat, the third generation, in some instances even the fourth generation in this book, those who've not themselves witnessed the partition at first hand, but nevertheless have felt its lingering trauma. Tell us why you felt the need to write this book after that splendid first book.
That's a question I ask myself all the time. I have to say this is the first sort of official thing for the book. The book just came out 2 weeks ago, so it's quite special to be here at this lovely intimate festival talking about it. Why another book on partition? That's a really important question, because now 75 years have passed since partition, and do we really need more books about it? Do we really need to still talk about it? Is it relevant? Does it define our relationships, not only with our neighboring countries, but also within our own country with people whom we deem the other? Has partition been the source of pain and continues to be the source of pain for people that live at the fringes of the nation? These are all questions that were in my mind when I started to put this book together. And I think the real impetus came because of the number of people who told me that the impact of partition ends with the generation that witnessed it. And this is something that my own family practices. My grandmother asserts this. I write it in the book that she says that I never wanted to pass anything on because I didn't think anyone after me would care about this partition. And the fact that she says this partition almost flippantly. And And then I think to myself that for the last 10 years, nearly 10 years, since 2013, I have actively thought and written and I guess recorded stories of partition as a third generation. That act in itself, does that not mean that partition impacts me? That I'm investing time and energy and brain space into it. But I'm just one person. So the reason why I started to put this together is because while I was doing my field research for my first book, which was on people who had lived through partition, I did a lot of what I called side research at the time, which was if their children or grandchildren were in the room, I would say, did you know this story? Or did you learn anything new today? And I would basically record a descendant perspective to see whether memory differed or memory surprised or emotions of hate or love or curiosity or even otherness were evoked during the descendant listening to their grandparent or parents' testimony. And it was always going to be side research for me, and then it accumulated, and then it became 5 years, 10 years. Okay, I have hundreds of interviews from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh about people that still have some sense of relationship to partition. It's not always the exact relationship that their ancestor may have. We are not trying to superimpose our memory onto their memory or their memory onto ours. We are trying to create new associations with that same memory. So that was the first reason, that we give so much importance to survivor testimony, but we fail to understand that memory does get passed down the generations and does impact, not always in a positive way, sometimes in a highly negative way, but the impact is also important to record. So we can see how memory is transmitted and whether it creates patterns. The other thing was that 75 years have passed since partition, as I mentioned. Relationships between the three nations of the erstwhile empire are fraught at best. Is there a way that I can bring the shape of an undivided land into a book? And so the way for me was to compile stories from people like myself, younger people, thinking back about partition. And I suppose the last reason is when we look at other events of similar nature, I hate to always compare partition and Holocaust, but it is unfortunately in theory one of the only things where theoretical texts can form basis for our arguments as well. So there is a lot of work done on post-memory of Holocaust, where people that have been in concentration camps or people that were marginalized at the time, their descendants have inherited not just stories but an attitude of never again, because these stories have been passed down. And I guess descendant testimony is given as much importance as survivor testimony, and this has just not happened with partition. So it was a way to create a record of memory so that this very sort of crippling, confused memory between Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis, where we hate, but then we meet overseas and we love one another and there is relationship. We can talk about this very paradoxical relationship also. But it was a way to create a record so that a testament is there for how complicated this relationship continues to be because of a historical event. Sorry for a very long-winded answer.
No. You know what I also like, Aanchal, about your book is the fact that in partition narratives, there is a compulsive dwelling on what happened on the western arm of the country. The eastern arm is left to another set of scholars, those who look at the partition of Bengal. I feel that is somewhere compartmentalizing a tragedy. I think a tragedy has to be seen in its broadest sense. Two partitions happened on the two borders, and it should not be left to two sets of scholars or two sets of chroniclers to chronicle that. What I like here is that you talk of the partition of Kashmir, you talk of people from Gujarat who went away, you talk in a very large part of the Northeast and of Bengal in particular. Which brings me to you, Samrat. You grew up in the Northeast. You have contributed your own memory and your family's story. I want to ask you two things. One, if you could very briefly for the audience here narrate your own family's story. as briefly as you can. And the other is, I'm very intrigued by the fact that you wrote and very actively at the time of the National Citizen Register, the NCR and the subsequent anti-CEA protests. Why do you think the register was put in force in Assam, of all the places, and not elsewhere? So let's talk of the politics of that as well.
So, first of all, thank you and congratulations again, Achal. I'm very glad that you're doing the work that you're doing, because these stories need to be told, and told in a way that is more, shall I say, about truth and reconciliation perhaps, rather than about atrocity propaganda, which is unfortunately what a lot of history has now become. My own family was affected by partition, both sides of my family. And so my father's side is from Sylhet, in what used to be undivided Assam, and is now a part of Bangladesh. It was possible for somebody to have been born in undivided India and been an Indian, and then by line drawn on a map by Sir Cyril Radcliffe become a Pakistani, and then a few years later become a Bangladeshi without moving house even once. So that was the experience of partition, a part of the experience of partition on that side. So my paternal grandparents were displaced from Sylhet and moved to, initially, I mean, because the first problem was, where do you go? You know, one fine day suddenly you have nowhere to go, you've become a refugee. And so where do you go? So my father's eldest brother was much older than the other kids, and he had already joined, he managed to find a job as a forester of some kind in the forest department in Bagmara in the Garo Hills of Meghalaya. So that's where they managed to go and find refuge. And so my family came to be settled eventually in Shillong, which is where I was born. So that's one side of the family. The other side was actually from Moimonshing, also in what is now Bangladesh. And they got booted out also, and they landed up in Jabalpur, and then eventually found their way to Calcutta. So that's the family story. And these stories remain relevant because, as you pointed out, the National Register of Citizens and the Citizenship Amendment Act are actually leftovers from partition, because we are still, in a sense, trying to determine who is an Indian. And especially in the East, this whole bogey of Bangladeshi infiltration and, Hindu or Muslim Bangladeshi, but Bangladeshi, this thing has been going on forever and forever. I have written a book on the Brahmaputra. I had occasion to travel the entire length of the river in India and a large part of it in Bangladesh. I couldn't do the China part of it. The thing is that once I traveled, I realized that a lot of this story of illegal immigration of Bangladeshis, or even so-called Rohingyas, is not true. But because it remains relevant to the politics, so you have the National Register of Citizens trying to throw out people, and the Citizenship Amendment Act trying to redefine people as citizens based on religion.
Right. Achal, every time I read any of your writings, I'm struck by the empathy you employ, whether it is talking to the people who witnessed it themselves, or in this case, in the case of this book, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren in many cases. What emerges from, by and large, and I must confess I haven't read the entire book yet. I'm reading parts of it, I'm taking my time over it, and it's a big book, so it's taking me a while. But the parts that I have read, there are largely stories of sharing, of looking back with loss, with longing, with pain. But surely there must also have been stories of hate. I mean, we've always believed that communalism is a conjoined twin of secularism, and then so is love and hate, it would seem. Is there something that you would like to share of a family, of a memory, of a interview, where you were struck by the heirloom of hate that they have carried for generations?
That's an interesting phrase because someone uses it in the book, hate as an
It's
heirloom.
frankly not mine. I remember it
Yeah.
from the book.
Firstly, I have to say that over the last 10 years, I had collected so many different kinds of interviews that when I started to compile this book, the question was, how do you categorize these interviews? Do you categorize them on the basis of Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, Parsi, Jain, other? Do you categorize them on the basis of Punjab or Bengal? Do you categorize them on the basis of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh? And any sense of categorization felt further divisive. And so what I ended up doing is that there are 24 chapters in the book. Each is categorized as per emotion. So there are chapters on, there's a chapter on belonging, there's a chapter on hope, a chapter on pain, a chapter on the other, there's a chapter on the everyday, because these things surpass any sense of religion or nationality, and they are quite humane, at least in their essence. And of course, I could get away from any sense of division further. But I think there are no chapters on violence, because violence becomes a sort of, and hate, becomes a kind of like an appendage to everything. There is always going to be a mention of something that was violent or something that was wrathful, or in any story, even stories about love or hope. But I was very careful to put together a chapter on the other, which is not just the making and unmaking of the other, but also the definition of the other. Who is a person we consider the other? Is it someone that we don't know enough about? It is someone who is another religion? Is it someone beyond a border who we may never actually see, but have understood this pre-described notion of the other? And the one thing I was searching for in my interviews was, are there any members of such families that have gone through immense trauma and violence that break the cycle of hate? Because it's not difficult to find. It's not difficult to find acts of violence and hate that has carried on since partition, but it is important to view it critically as well. Why do we hate somebody? Especially for something that may have happened 75 years ago. Is it logical to carry on that hate? These were just general questions I was asking people. And I think also my interview process was quite informal to allow myself. It was more conversational than interviewee. But there are two instances in the chapter on the other where two people in different families think about why they have been told to hate the other. One, because in one instance, a woman falls in love with someone who is another religion, and she is forced to unlearn what she considers the other religion to always have been, which I think is a very common thing, that you can say, oh, I hate all Hindus, but you, my friend, are okay, or I hate all Muslims, but I have one Muslim friend, so it's okay. Or I hate all Pakistan and all Pakistanis. And what does it mean to hate an entire country? Can you hate all of them without ever meeting them? And then when you meet in the UK or America, you meet with such brotherhood because they speak your language and they eat your food and they can pronounce your name in the way it's supposed to be pronounced. So it's a very confusing, ironic, paradoxical legacy that we have inherited. But I wanted to look at otherness and hate quite critically. And in these two instances, one, of course, because of love, and the other because simply hate as an heirloom stopped making sense. Two, interviewees question, why do we hate? But I have to say that aspect, to be able to question, requires a lot of unlearning on the part of people. Like you mentioned empathy. The only reason I can have empathy is because I understand there is something to be learned from everybody, which means there is something to unlearn in myself. Whenever I speak to someone, we are born on one side of the border, in a particular religious construct, in a particular class, caste, and these define our behaviors with other people. But I think the minute, like, I went to Pakistan and I spoke with Bangladeshis, you realize that even that word partition means different things to the three different nations. I'm sure you've also encountered this in your research, that for India it meant loss, for Pakistan it meant gaining of nationhood, for Azadi, yes, for Bangladesh 1971 holds far more prominence than 47, and so when we speak of things like truth and reconciliation, and you said this in your interview, that there is an order to that phrase, truth and reconciliation, and we need some sense of truth before we can reconcile. But if truth is multifold, and truth is determined by what side of the border and what nationality you carry, and cannot be accepted by other countries of the erstwhile empire, then what does reconciliation really look like? You know, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
What is the word you use in Bangla? Because in Urdu, there is taqseem.
Taqseem, yeah.
So there is taqseem, there is... Okay, so there is hijrat, which is actually a word which is moored in Islamic theology of the early years of Islamic history. When the Prophet moved from Makkah to Medina, the word was hijrat, as in travel. So that word has been used increasingly for those Muslims who chose to move from India in search of a safe haven, you know, because that was also the impulse behind the Prophet's journey. So yes, there is hijrat, there is taqseem, there is batwara, there is partition. I'm curious, what would you say in Bangla?
Deshbhag. Deshbhag. The breaking of the country.
You wanted to say something.
I wanted to know if you wanted to add something to the truth and reconciliation. And anything.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree that truth has to come before reconciliation. And it is also definitely true that it's remembered in different ways, not only in different countries, the 3 different countries of the subcontinent, but very much within this country as well. And so perhaps we can just start at home before we go to the bigger problem of how, you know, how the Pakistanis and how the Bangladeshis might look at it. Because the Pakistanis, yes, they view it as independence, as they got independence, and the Bangladeshis more complicated, because first they got independence and then they got independence again.
I think the one really fascinating thing that I never realized is how these 3 countries view it differently. So I remember an interview with a young woman my age, probably mid-30s, who was Pakistani, and she's telling me that her parents met because of partition. And she's mid-30s, so I'm thinking, how can your parents have met in 47? I said, so your parents met during partition? And she said, yes, my parents met during partition in 71. And I was forced to pause and think, of course you're Pakistani, so 1971, which is the birth of Bangladesh, is the partition of Pakistan. And then I started thinking, what else in our conversation did she say that I misinterpreted because I'm Indian? And then she looks at me and says, well, what do you call 1971? And I felt really silly in saying that I call it the Third India-Pakistan War. So for Pakistan, it's partition, 1971. For India, it's the Third India-Pakistan War. For Bangladesh, it's independence. And so, right. So it's just a classic example of, you know, manifold truths.
And if I may add something, the numbers, I mean, we know the numbers, we remember them, but I don't know if the rest of the country, you know, the parts which were less affected, shall we say, because the official figure, according to the Bangladesh government, of the Bangladesh genocide of 1971, which broke into the news thanks to a Goan journalist from Pakistan named Anthony Mascarenhas, the figure is 3 million people killed. It's one of the big genocides in the history of the world.
Which is far more than actually 47.
Which is more than 47, which was 1 to 2 million. But we are talking in any case about figures of millions of people killed, and the figures of people displaced is shocking. You know, it's 15 million, 20 million, those are the figures, and those are credible, plausible figures, long researched. So,
but I think one of the problems where we quote these large figures, and you and I have spoken so much about this, is that the individuality of the witness or the story of the witness is somehow lost in it, which is why for the longest time, partition history became almost statistical in nature and data-centric and archival history, whereas any oral history did not emerge until the late 80s, early 90s at best.
So there is talk of truth and reconciliation, but then there are also gestures. Oh, sorry. Yeah, right. So it's all very well to talk of truth and reconciliation, but then there are also gestures such as the announcement that 14th August henceforth will be celebrated, though that is a very, very odd word to use in this context, as the national, what is it? The Partition Horrors Day. Now, I'm curious as to what mindset is behind such an announcement, because Surely the partition is not just our tragedy, it is a tragedy that is shared on both sides of the partition. And while I cannot use the word celebration, but even a commemoration, even a marking of such an event, surely would require an acknowledgement, if not an sort of, inclusion of the share of the hurt and the losses of the other side. So what do you make of this?
I think, well, it's complicated to answer this question. As someone who writes about, and I write about this in my epilogue, I had to think very much about what it meant to commemorate partition. But as someone who writes and thinks about partition on an everyday basis and has for 10 years, I think that it's important to have some devoted day to commemorate. I don't know what that will look like. I don't know, because in a lot of interviews I've done with survivors, do they celebrate 14th August, 15th August? Is it a day to celebrate, or is it
one family that does, which not celebrates, but they come together on the 14th.
Yeah, multiple.
Yeah,
yes, they come, they talk. There is a grandfather who writes a grandson letters on the 14th of August every year. There are divided families between India and Pakistan that call one another, and it's sort of like days of mourning. But what does it mean as a nation state to commemorate an event that does not only belong to you? So in the epilogue, I write that it's complicated, firstly, not only for the etymology of the phrase partition horrors remembrance day. Are we to only remember the horrors? Are we not to remember things like broken relationships or longing or things left on the other side, friendships, lovers parted, all these things, human things? Are we only to remember the horrors which media and films have perpetuated anyway over the last 75 years, us versus them, Muslim versus non-Muslim? Are we only to remember those horrors? Are we to remember those trains? And then the date, 14th August, which happens to be Pakistan's Independence Day. I feel like a day of commemoration of partition could have been one step to begin this reconciliation process, because it would have forced, now this is only my opinion, it would have forced the countries of the erstwhile empire to come together and at least talk, listen, have voices of survivors be heard, have maybe books like this and people like Samrat and me and others like us talk about it. But to choose 14th August, which is actually a celebration of our neighbors' independence, it seemed complicated and telling. And perhaps a day like June 3rd, which was the day that the partition plan was accepted, June 3rd, 1947, was accepted by the members of the League and the Congress and the representatives of the Sikhs and other communities, that would have been a better day, because it's a day we all shared. I don't know what the first year will look like. And this is something that I ask in my interviews with survivors, that when 14th, 15th August comes, do you celebrate it or do you mourn it? Because independence and partition are two different events and must be considered separate in the ways in which they are remembered. I don't know if you want to add something. No?
So my friend, the philosopher, Professor Ramu Gandhi, used to say that we are a deeply religious nation. We have pinned dan for our ancestors. We pray for their souls. He said, why is it that no leader on either side of the border ever thought of something that approximates a pinned dan? After all, lives were lost. After all, people were killed. What their religions were and what those religious rites should be is a separate matter. But as a philosopher, he kept pondering the question, why have we never had a collective mourning for our dead? And that's a question that's still hanging in the air, because I think an announcement such as the 14th August announcement actually doesn't take care of that lingering loss. But my question to both of you would now be, and I think that could be the last question, and then maybe we can take some from the audience. Would you say that a lapse of after 75 odd years, does the pain go away? Does it blur memories? When you speak to the third and the fourth generation, do you find that it is their memories that they are adding on to their parents and grandparents' memories? Is it a Gujarat and a Ayodhya that is supplementing, complementing, adding to those memories and hurts? Is it a new, in the case of the Northeast, a Nelly massacre or something else that is adding another layer to that hurt and therefore in some way changing, subsuming, altering memories?
Okay. Definitely, memory keeps being shaped and reshaped. And we are obviously in a period of our country's politics where it is being purposefully reshaped for current political ends. So there's no doubt about that. We saw it in the case of a film recently called The Kashmir Files. We see it in a lot of history telling where Aurangzeb becomes current affairs and the country's GDP becomes history. So definitely there is a very purposeful sort of remolding of partition for current political ends. I'm glad to say that so far it has been rejected politically in both the places which were directly affected by partition. Punjab and Bengal were the two which suffered the most. Northeast India also did suffer the loss of some territory in the sense that lines were drawn which divided communities, and Assam saw a referendum in the case of Sylhet. But I think both Punjab and Bengal, having politically so far refused to fall for the narrative of continuing the rhetoric of Hindu-Muslim hatred, which led to partition in the first place, is a positive sign. What it means, at least as far as I can interpret it, is that at least in Bengal, I'm pretty sure what it means never again. We've been through it not once, but twice, right? As a Hindu of East Bengal origin, I have family members who were affected in 1971 as well. We've been through it not once but twice. We've suffered in the Northeast as well, where many of the insurgencies were provoked by the large influx of people from elsewhere. It provoked understandable fears that they would be swamped by the refugees, and that is what has continued till today in the form of NRC and CAA and so on. So as long as the people there say never again, I think that that is a sense that they want to move on, that they want to put it behind them with truth and reconciliation and not with further hatred.
I want to address the other part of your question, which is the reason for why these memories are important to be passed on, whether they are painful or not. And I just want to do a small reading from the book on the chapter on memory, which also addresses another question that you had: how do younger people create new memories with already existing memories? The memory of partition is complex by all accounts. Studied 7 decades on, it is a canvas left with many blank spaces. Purposefully forgetting to remember, consciously remembering to forget. Sometimes I cannot remember also means I don't want to remember. I deduce that no matter how nuanced a memory we may collect from another, no matter how close it may feel to us, no matter how deeply it may inform our understanding of the past, it will never truly be ours, for we have not experienced it. In that sense, the conversations in this book are born from the understanding that received memory of partition is distinct from eyewitness recall, because it will always be mediated by unavoidable distance. Those who preserve the memories of their ancestors and others are not trying to emulate any feeling, but to create new engagements with the same memory. How can we best carry their stories forward without appropriating them, without unduly calling attention to ourselves, and without in turn having our own stories displaced by them? Every generation feels differently, and within that generation there will be further distinctions among groups. The purpose of these conversations with subsequent generations on the memory of partition, its remembering and forgetting, is purely to understand how memory is disseminated, discovered, reclaimed, or distorted.
Hi, Lady Anshul. Welcome to Goa. We call it the land of Feni and harmony. I'm happy to know that you are Aman Ki Asha soldier of the India-Pakistan relationship. I also come from the school of thought that with Pakistan, that we have more things to unite us than those that divide us. Though I believe that we don't have the same element of emotion with China and America. My question to you, I've taken my kids to Kartarpur. I have a 14-year-old son because we are huge Sikh phils, as in we emote in the teachings of, though we are Catholics, the goodness of the Sikh way of life. So my kids went to Kartarpur. My youngest son, 14, was motivated to see the real Pakistan with the love and emotion we got in Kartarpur. So we touched base with friends in Punjab, including Sidhuji. Unfortunately, he's not there because of his connect with Imran. He's also not there. And also a lady called Anam Zakaria. She's a Pakistani writer. She's now based in Canada.
Yes.
I'll cut my story, my question is short. I met a Pakistani traveler in a hotel lobby in Delhi. The moment I saw his passport, I started my Aman Ki Asha emotion. And I asked him, I engaged him on the question of Kashmir. His response was, y'all did unto us in Bangladesh through your Mukti Bahini, which is what we are doing unto y'all in Kashmir. That's one question to you. And I would like to get your signed copy because...
What's the question in it?
No, the question is, do you think the manifestation of what Pakistan is doing in Kashmir has got its reciprocatory quotient because of what we did in Bangladesh?
Well, I think that, well, let me ask you a question. Is it always as easy as tit for tat? Because that's happening a lot in our nation as well. Obviously, because you and I come from the same thought of mutual understanding and empathy, I don't prescribe to the notion of agar tumne ye yahan pe kara hai to main ye yahan pe karunga. And of course the situations, the geopolitical situations of what happened in 1971 vis-a-vis what is happening in Kashmir now, drawing a line of Kashmir now to Kashmir in 47 is very, very different, instigated by very different political factors. So I would say the simple answer is no, but that's a naive answer on my part because I'm not trying to engage in the political sense with it. Do you want to add something?
Yes. The logic of 1971, I'm not talking about Kashmir, I'm talking about 1971. The logic of 1971 was very simple. It was that the people of Bangladesh, the Bengalis, wanted to separate country. And India helped them in that. So that was the logic of 1971.
But I want to add this on Kashmir. People who think they can understand Kashmir now without understanding what happened in Kashmir at partition, this is impossible because it is a process. Partition is not a singular activity. It's a long process that has continued on. So to that gentleman, I would say that perhaps you should see the progression. And it's very difficult to juxtapose two different political events and compare them.
We have two more questions. Perhaps you listen to both of them and then you respond on some. Okay? Go ahead, please.
I wanted to know, I have not read your book, first of all, definitely read, but I wanted to know whether you have covered, you must have discussing cause and effect of partition. First, just I want a small comment. 1947 is our right to celebrate, whether 14th August or 15th, because we got independence from colonialism. That is the most important. So whether it was divided India or united India is a secondary issue. Second, right from 1757 till 1857, and from 1857 to 1947, this divide and rule policy was hegemonized by Britishers to divide us. If you see, before 1757, there was no clashes, no rights between Hindus and Muslims. 1857, uprising of 1857, we fought united. There was jizya tax, but jizya tax was totally not communal. Rights had not taken place. So question is this. So this divide, we are still suffering from British colonial hangover, that divide and rule policy, and still carrying forward Renaissance, carrying forward that legacy. And the second question, after 1947, the same divide is created, but the divide only Pakistan and the Bangladesh. We don't face this side. Why we don't face this divide in remaining part of India, the central India and South India? And secondly, the Brahmanical, do you think the Brahmanical?
My question to you is, have you looked at the case of divided families in the Malabar? Because you had Muslims who were living in what became Pakistan, and
Sure. Maybe the divided family question first. Yes, there are plenty stories of divided families, not only from the Malabar region, but many different regions of India and Pakistan, and families that are of two religions as well. One became Sikh, the other became Muslim. So yeah, and I think those stories are quite tragic, because that's really when a child is born, or when a marriage happens, or when a death happens, you can't meet your sibling or your nephew. And I also touch on how things like social media or the radio sometimes act as ways to connect people in these circumstances. So yes, the divided families. On that note, there is an excellent book only on divided families written by Wazira Zamindar. She looks at families in Karachi and Delhi, specifically Muslim families divided. Very, very good, heavily researched, yeah. And to your question of, firstly, why... Yes. Yes, I have, and I want to say the roots are multifold. It is easy to say that I'm always really wary to put a general thing on partition, a general blanket of the reason for why partition happened, and it is not to absolve anyone of any blame, but to say that the circumstances of why people suffered were so specific to their situation that you need to hold those accountable in those specific situations. So, first, to answer your question about why partition is discussed so much in the north and not so much in the south and center, the simple answer is because of the areas that it impacted and the migration patterns that happened. I would say that perhaps in Goa, yes, someone mentioned earlier, there are families that migrated to Karachi. I have select instances of people who migrated from Madras to Karachi, from Kerala to the northwest frontier province, but they are select. The largest migrations happened between what is now Pakistan, the north of India, and Bengal and Bangladesh. So that's why. And what was your other question? Sorry, the earlier question? Okay. But I want to say this book covers post-47. Post-47, the generations that came after, to see why partition, we have not been able to let go of partition.
No. Vivek, have we run out of time? Should we close? Okay. No, I think we just need to look at partition with greater empathy, as she does. But even those of us who may not be studying it in a scholarly fashion, but are just we are seeing the effects that unspooled from it. See partition as a spool of thread. It's just coming out of it. And what is coming out of it is increasingly taking a communal overtone. What we see around us is communalism, and that I think we can directly link in many ways to 47. And the lesson that I personally feel from what I've studied, I'm a student of literature, not of history, so I increasingly look at literature as it holds up a mirror to society. And the lesson I seem to draw from it is that if anything, there was enough violence and gore and horrors and tragedies in the partition to have taught us one enduring lesson, and that was never again. Never should we do this again. And yet it is a lesson that we found so easy to forget, to overlook. And I think today, in many ways, we are paying the consequences of that. Not just those who lived through the partition. There was somebody here who talked about why is it of such overriding concern in one part of the country and not so much in the other. It is true that families were directly affected in a very large way north of the Vindhyas, and to a lesser extent and in a more localized extent, whether it was Malabar or it was the Goan Christians and so on and so forth. But I think the consequences that I'm alluding to affect the entire country. I don't think they are confined to states. Punjab was actually a bloody passage. It was a corridor through which caravans, kafilas went through, both back and forth. So also Bangladesh, it had a very, very bloodied partition and a very prolonged partition. Very long drawn out. There was 47. And why just 47? Let's go back to the original division of Bangladesh, of Bengal, to create West and East Bengal. So let's go back 100 years and start from there. So in that sense, Bengal has been especially unfortunate to have had 1, 2, 3 series of partitions. But I will conclude with this, that I think it is not just the states or the people or the families who were directly affected. I think it is all of us in India today who in some ways are reaping a very bitter harvest. And this is something we need to be mindful of. Thank you.
I just want to make one last comment regarding this question. He's not here, but it's very easy to blame everything on the British. The divide and rule and the caste system and everything. I mean, just because we are, we are defending Muslims against Hindutva, rise of Hindutva, it doesn't mean that we have to, go back and say some lies about them. Yes, there was a communal conflict before also, and that's all I wanted to say.
But the one thing I did notice when I was doing this is how, and this took years of research, so the number of times someone actually talked about the British or decolonization was painfully few, and only people who live in the diaspora, because the complications between India, Pakistan and Bangladesh over the last 75 years, the bitterness or just the complexity of our relationship has rendered the invisible, the initial cause of decolonization almost invisible. Like it doesn't, hardly anyone talked about that. And only people who were impacted in the diaspora by the empire still talk about it. That's it.
The thing is, it's true that we talk about the British dividing India and divide and rule. The fact of the matter is they also united it before they divided it. And anybody who's interested just has to look for the volumes of treaties called Aitchison's treaties. There are hundreds of treaties which were signed with independent rulers. Even in 1947, we talk about Sardar Patel and the unification of the princely states, 545, 550 princely states. So, the fact of the matter is that the political unification of the British Indian Empire happened under the British. They divided it into 3 before leaving. And so India, Pakistan and Bangladesh are the 3 remnants of the British Indian Empire. They united it first and then they divided it.
Thank you so much. Folks, I'd like to quickly, big hand please, first of all, for this wonderful panel. Tomorrow, Samrat Chowdhury has written one of the finest travel books in since 1947, actually. Certainly in the Indian genre, Samrat's book is a classic. He's going to be talking about it tomorrow. Rakshanda Jalil is one of the most dazzlingly diverse talents that we have in India today, an unbelievable range of her writings. Too many books to even begin to mention. She will be speaking again tomorrow. And thank you so much, Anchal, for this lovely book, In the Language of Remembering. In the Language of Remembering. Please buy a copy. Anchal will be here today and tomorrow for signing the book. Please keep your seats for a really important session that we're so pleased to have here. We'll start in